Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back to another PS4 jailbreak tutorial. So once again, we're revisiting the Raspberry Pi method of jailbreaking the PS4 automatically on 11.0, which you can do using a Raspberry Pi. You can also use a LucFox Pico device, which we've covered in a previous video. Now, the LucFox Pico has the benefit of being the cheapest all-in-one device to automatically jailbreak your PS4 on 11.0. The Raspberry Pi is more expensive and it requires an SD card for the operating system, but it does have a number of advantages, some additional features that you will not find on the LucFox Pico devices. Now, one of the main advantages to using a Raspberry Pi is that it can actually pass through the internet connection that it receives to the PS4 down the Ethernet cable using PPPoE, which means you do not have to adjust your network settings on your PS4 after you successfully jailbreak. It will automatically share the internet connection with it. So no need to change your network settings whenever you switch between trying to use the internet on the PS4 and when you try to run the jailbreak. So that will happen automatically. That's one big benefit. It also has things like USB pass-through, a web server for configuring the settings, but it also has a payload server, FTP server, SMB, and a bunch of other features. Now, the Raspberry Pi models that have been tested are listed here on the GitHub repo, so you can check them out there, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other Raspberry Pi models that will also work. So in my initial video, I used a full-sized Raspberry Pi 4B, which has a dedicated Ethernet port, which you can use to run the jailbreak. However, in this case, I'm going to use a Raspberry Pi 02W just for a change, which does not have a dedicated Ethernet port because it's one of these smaller Raspberry Pi models. So for those ones, you will need to get yourself a micro USB to Ethernet adapter, and that's what I'm going to use to connect it up to the PS4. You can also add one of these adapters to a full-sized Raspberry Pi model so that you have two Ethernet ports on it, one which can be used to pass through the internet connection and the other one that can be used to run the jailbreak on the PS4. So you got lots of different options for configuration with the Raspberry Pis. Anyway, with all that explanation out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the setup process. So we are going to need a micro SD card for this. So we're going to need a micro SD card adapter or some way to connect it up to your computer. So you want to connect a micro SD card up to your PC. And then on the PC, there's going to be a few things that we're going to need. So we're going to need to head over to the Pi-Pwn project because we're going to need access to the install script for this. We also want to download the payloads because we might as well add the payloads onto the payload server so we can use that feature, which will be linked in the description. We also want some software that we can use to remotely access the Raspberry Pi with SSH. So my preferred method is to use MOBA Xterm, or you could use PuTTY to connect to the Raspberry Pi remotely. And finally, we also want the Raspberry Pi Imager software so that we can get the Raspberry Pi operating system on the SD card. So once you have your micro SD card connected to your computer, we're going to open up the Raspberry Pi Imager software here. We're going to choose the device and you're going to pick your Raspberry Pi model here. So Raspberry Pi 02W, I'm going to select that, then choose the operating system. The operating system, you're going to want to go to Raspberry Pi OS Other, and then you're going to want to select the Raspberry Pi OS Lite, which is the version that does not come with a desktop environment. So we're going to select that version here, 64-bit. If you don't have access to the 64-bit version, then just use the 32-bit version. So we're going to select and then choose storage. We're going to select our micro SD card and then click next. And then we want to edit the settings. We're going to want to connect this to our Wi-Fi network. So we're going to set up a host name. I'm going to use pppwn.local as the host name. Then the username, I'm just going to call the username modded. The password, I'm just going to use, just test as the password. And then we're going to enter our Wi-Fi configuration. So this is the important thing here. Unless you have two Ethernet ports on your Raspberry Pi that you're using, one for an internet connection, most of you will not have that. So you'll be using Wi-Fi to connect the Raspberry Pi to the internet. So you need to make sure you get this entered correctly. So enter the SSID of your Wi-Fi network in here, which obviously you can find on your computer just by checking what your computer's connected to. And then from there, you're going to want to go ahead and enter the Wi-Fi password. And then you can select your wireless country, your time zone. And then you also want to make sure you go into services and enable SSH and use password authentication. Make sure those options are enabled. And then we can eject media when finished and enable telemetry. And then we can click save. And then do you want to apply these customization settings? We want to say yes. And then all existing data on the device will be erased. Are you sure you want to continue? We'll say yes. Make sure you've obviously backed up any data on that SD card before doing this. Okay, so once it says you can now remove the SD card, we can click continue. and we'll unplug that SD card and plug it into the Raspberry Pi. Okay, so once you plug in the micro SD card into the Raspberry Pi, we're going to want to connect that Raspberry Pi to the PS4 via a USB cable. So with this Raspberry Pi 02W, there's two micro USB ports, but the one at the far end is for power. It's got PWR in. So we're going to plug it into that one to power the device from the PS4. Now, if you are using a USB to Ethernet adapter, now is also the time that you're going to want to make sure that is plugged in to the Raspberry Pi. So make sure that is connected before you power on the device. So once you have that all hooked up and it's all powered, we're going to wait a few seconds, probably give it about a minute so that it has time to boot and automatically connect to your Wi-Fi network so that it will be accessible. So just give it a little bit of time. While we're waiting for that to boot up, we're going to open up MOBA Xterm or PuTTY to connect to it. So if you're using MOBA Xterm, we're going to go to Session. We're going to go to SSH. The remote host is going to be pppwn.local. At least that's what I set the host name to when I was setting up the customization settings for the operating system. Then the username, we're going to specify the username that you also put in those customization settings when setting up the operating system, and the port is going to be 22. So from there we can click OK, and it's going to try and connect to the Raspberry Pi. So you can see here, unable to connect. Okay, so I've given it a few more seconds now, so we'll try again. And here we go. So it's now fully booted, so we can accept the new server host key. And there we go, we are connected. We have remote access to the Raspberry Pi. So we can now set up the Pi-Pwn exploit on the device. So what we're going to do is head over to the Pi-Pwn project, and we're going to scroll down to the install script, which are all of these commands here. So we're just going to click the button in the top right to copy it. And then we're just going to right click and paste it. And we'll say yes to paste all of the lines in, and then just press enter, and then just wait for that to do its thing. Now, if you don't want the Raspberry Pi to connect to your Wi-Fi network, you can just plug in the USB to Ethernet adapter to your router, or something that can give it an internet connection over a wired connection instead of Wi-Fi. Then you should be able to connect to it and get the install script up and running. Okay, so once we get through the install script, we then get to the questionnaire. So first question, do you want to enable the option to use the Python slower Pwn version? Generally, you should put N for no, because we want to use the faster C++ version. The Python version does tend to be more stable on Raspberry Pi devices. So, you know, if you do run into any instability issues where the exploit is not loading properly on your particular Raspberry Pi model, then you might want to go in and change this. You can always go back and change it later on. So for now, anyway, we're going to say N for no and press enter. Now we're asked, do you want to install an FTP server? I will say yes, why not? Might as well have the option to access the file system of the Raspberry Pi through FTP to update the payloads. Do you want to set the root account password? I'll just say yes and press enter, and I'll just enter a password for that. And there we go. You can now log into the FTP server with the username root and the password that you just set. So we should be able to access FTP. So do you want to set up a SMB Share? We might as well just do both to show both of them here. So we'll do Y for yes and get the SMB Share enabled. Do you want to use Gold 10 if it is available for the selected firmware? Of course, we want to use Gold 10, so we're going to do Y for yes and press enter. Do you want to change the PPPoE username and password? If you select no, then these defaults will be used. Again, I will say no. We'll just use the default PPP. And this is particularly important for the internet pass-through feature once the jailbreak has been loaded. So we're going to say N for no, press enter. So it says, do you want to detect a console shutdown and try to restart Pwn? Generally, I don't need to do this, I don't think, because I'm literally powering the Raspberry Pi from the console. So if the console shuts down, the Raspberry Pi shuts down, which restarts Pwn anyway when you restart the console. So that shouldn't really be required. That might only be for if you're powering the Raspberry Pi from another device so it's constantly powered, even when the console is shut down. So I'm going to say no, I don't need to detect the console shutdown and restart Pwn. Do you want the console to connect to the internet after Pwn? Yes, we do. So we'll put in Y for yes, press enter. Are you using a USB to Ethernet adapter for the console connection? In this case, yes, I am, because this Raspberry Pi is a 02W. It does not have an Ethernet port on it. So we're going to say Y for yes for using an Ethernet adapter if you are using one. Do you want to try and detect if Goldhen is running and skip running Pwn if found? Useful for rest mode. This is kind of important because if the USB devices are not being powered and you put it into rest mode and then recover from rest mode, then it will act as though it's trying to jailbreak the console again, even though you've just recovered from rest mode, and then it will not be passing through the internet connection anymore. So we're going to say yes for this. So if it detects that Goldhen is running, it will continue with the internet pass-through instead of trying to jailbreak it again. So we'll do Y for yes. Do you want Pwn to run in verbose mode? That's only necessary for troubleshooting. So we'll do N for no and press enter. Would you like to change the timeout for Pwn to restart? If it hangs, the default is 5 minutes. Generally, this hasn't really been a problem for me on my Raspberry Pi devices, so I will just leave this. So N for no and press enter. Would you like to change the firmware version being used? The default is 11.0. I'm on 11.0 on my PS4, so I'm going to say N for no. Obviously, if you're on a different firmware, you're going to want to enter Y and then select the firmware that you are using. So N for no. And finally, would you like to change the Pi LAN interface? Detected LAN interface is ETH0. This is why you want to have the Ethernet adapter, if you're using one, plugged into the Raspberry Pi before you run the setup script, so it can detect the correct Ethernet adapter. So in my case, it will be ETH0 because there is no other Ethernet device connected. If you have 2 Ethernet ports on your Raspberry Pi, then you're going to want to change this to like ETH1, which will be your Ethernet adapter. So ETH1 will be your Ethernet adapter, and you're going to want to change it. Otherwise, if you only have 1 Ethernet port, it should always be ETH0. So I will say no, I will not change it because it's already detected ETH0. Man, I thought we were done, but there's more. Do you want to use the original IPv6 address that was used in Pwn? I will just say N for no. I'll use the one that's compatible with all PS4 models. So I'll press enter. Would you like to change the host name? The default is Pi-Pwn. No, that should be fine. And there we go. That is finally done. The big questionnaire finally over. So there we go. It now reboots the Raspberry Pi. All we need to do now is plug in the Ethernet cable between the Raspberry Pi and your PS4. And that should be it. Okay, so booting up into the PS4, we're going to head into our settings, our network settings, connect to the internet, set up an internet connection using a LAN cable, using custom. And then, of course, we're going to go ahead and select PPPoE once it comes up. There we go, PPPoE. You're going to want to enter PPP as the user ID and password unless you explicitly changed it in the setup script. Otherwise, it's going to be PPP for user ID and password. This is necessary for the pass-through feature for the internet connection afterwards. So we're going to click next and then automatic, and do not use proxy. And that is essentially it. So if we just head into system and system information, we can see the IP address there. So that was what looks like maybe a failed attempt. Yeah, that was a failed attempt. So all we're going to do now is wait. So you can see the IP address pops up again. So we're just going to keep waiting until it successfully jailbreaks. Now, in terms of the speed of this, it does feel more or less the same as a Luckfox Pico. It might be a little bit slower, but then I am using the 02W rather than like a full-size Raspberry Pi model. So I think it's pretty comparable to the speed of the Luckfox Pico, and mostly the same. You can switch it to the Python method, which will be more reliable, more stable, but it will take a bit longer for each attempt. Okay, there we go. Pi-Pwn Goldhen 2.4 B17.3. So we are up and running. And you can see that we still have an IP address here. So it is literally now going to share the internet connection it's receiving through Wi-Fi down the Ethernet cable over PPPoE. So you don't have to adjust any of your network settings. And that's one of the big downsides to using some other method, whether it's an offline method or using like a Luckfox Pico, is always having to switch your network settings on the PS4 after the jailbreak is successful over to Wi-Fi or swapping out the Ethernet cable in the console itself to get a wired connection. You don't have to do that with this because as soon as the jailbreak's done, you are connected to the internet without having to adjust any settings. So for example, what's something that uses the internet? Let's say the Homebrew store. Let's go ahead and run this. So we'll go ahead and run the Homebrew store. And there we go. It says there's an update available and it's updating online. So we do have an internet connection. It is being supplied by the Raspberry Pi itself. So that is one of the major benefits to using this method over a Luckfox Pico. So we'll go ahead and exit out of the Homebrew store. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other advantages. So if we open up the internet browser, we can go to pppwn.local. And if we go back to config page here, so pppwn.local. So in here, you have access to the options that we configured in the install script. So you can change them. You can change the Ethernet interface. You can change the supported firmware version to a different firmware. You can change the delay after Pwn hangs. So set to 5 minutes by default, but you can make that shorter. And all of that stuff is all in here. Now there's also network settings. So you can adjust the PPP username and password for the internet pass-through. You can adjust your Wi-Fi SSID and password for connecting the Raspberry Pi to your home network connection. So you've got all of the options in there. And then of course you can also restart Pwn. You can reboot the Raspberry Pi or shut down the Raspberry Pi from here, or update to the latest version. And there's also the ability to load payloads. Now we don't have any payloads added in here yet. So let's go ahead and add the payloads. So if we switch on over to our computer, so if I run an FTP client like FileZilla, now it actually does say that you should use active mode instead of passive mode. So I believe in order to do that, we can go to the site manager and create a new site. I'll call this Pi0. So in here, we're going to do protocol FTP, host is pppwn.local, port is going to be 21. And everything else should be fine here. So ask for password. We'll just do normal. We'll enter username root. Password is going to be the password that I set. And then in the transfer settings, we want to make sure we change the transfer mode to active. So we do not want it to be using passive mode. And then we'll click OK. Okay, well, apparently it asked me the password anyway. So we'll go ahead and go to the site manager and connect to our Raspberry Pi. Enter the password. Press OK. And that will get us connected over to the Raspberry Pi. So we'll allow access. And there we go. We now have access to the Raspberry Pi's SD card. And there is a payloads folder in here that you can put the payloads inside. So if we go to our PS4 payloads that we downloaded from EchoStretch's GitHub repo, we can go ahead and copy those all in here. And there they go. They're all added in there. And we now have access to all of the payloads. So now if we switch back over once again to our console and reload this page, all of the payloads that I just put on there now show up, and we can select any one we want to load, like the disable updates payload, and you can see it will run that on the PS4 using the Goldhen bin loader. You need to make sure the Goldhen bin loader is enabled by going into the Goldhen settings, going into the server settings, and making sure enable bin loader server is ticked. Otherwise, that will not have worked. The other benefit here is that you can also remotely load these payloads from another device that's connected to your network. So if we switch back over to the computer as an example here, I can access the same site on any other device that is connected to my local network, to my router. And then I can also adjust the settings from here, and I can even remotely load payloads from here as well. So you'll see as soon as I hit disable updates and we switch back over to the console, you can see payload received, and then we get disabled updates. So you can also load all of the payloads remotely from there as well. So I guess one of the last things to show would be the SMB server. So we can also access the file system through SMB. So if we right click on this PC, we can go to map network drive in Windows. Obviously, there are different ways that you do this in other operating systems, but we're going to do //pppwn.local, then /pppwn, and then finish. And that should try and connect. Now this can happen. It's supposed to not require any credentials, and yet it's not allowing me to connect to it. Fix this by editing the group policy in control panel. You can use the group policy editor to fix this issue. So I believe you have to go into administrative templates, and then we go down to network, and then it was something LAN manager or something like that. LAN man workstation, that's what you need to go into. So from here, you can then go to enable insecure guest logins. And if you right click and edit that and set that to enable and then apply and click OK, then this should not be a problem anymore. We can click OK, and now we get access. So you can see we now have the Raspberry Pi just showing up as a drive on my computer, a network drive that I can just double click and access, and then I can swap out any of the payloads from here. So yeah, you can either use SMB or you can use FTP. It's up to you which method you want to use. I believe you could also probably just SSH into it as well and copy files over that way. So you have lots of different options for swapping out the files and updating things. Now, one final thing just to complete this is rest mode support. So you can see here we've got Detective Gold 10 is running, useful for rest mode. So that way, when we come out of rest mode, it's not going to switch back to running the exploit again. It will continue with the internet pass-through. So in order to make that work correctly, you do need to adjust one setting. So if you go into settings and scroll down to your power saving settings, and then go to set features available in rest mode, you're going to want to make sure supply power to USB ports is turned off. That way the device is not being continuously powered when it's put into rest mode. So make sure that's turned off. And then obviously we want to keep applications suspended enabled for rest mode to work to keep the jailbreak running. So that should be pretty much everything. So that's really the benefit of using the Raspberry Pi method on the PS4. So lots of different options added to this project since its inception. If you go back and look at the initial video I did on this, it was pretty bare bones back then, but now we have all of these additional features, so I thought it was worth an update. And yeah, obviously the Luckfox Pico is still a cheaper alternative. It just doesn't have as many options. So anyway, that's basically it for this one. Hope you guys enjoyed it or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. And once again, I'll hopefully see you guys in the next video.